The sun blazed overhead, casting shimmering waves of heat over cracked asphalt road. A lone stretch of wilderness hugged its sides, where dry bushes and tall, swaying grass rustled in the breeze. Nestled in a small hidden burrow, 3 fragile bobcat cubs lay huddled together. Their tiny bodies trembled, weak, hungry, and barely able to lift their heads. The mother bobcat circled them anxiously, nudging each one with her nose. Their fur, once thick and soft, had started to cling to their fragile frames. The scorching heat drained the last of their strength. She had been searching for food, but the land had betrayed her, empty, lifeless. She let out a low whimper, pacing in frustration. Her sharp ears twitched as a truck rumbled past on the nearby road, sending a cloud of dust into the air. The smell of humans lingered. She hesitated. Humans were dangerous, but what choice did she have? A soft mule from her weakest cub made her decision for her. She had to act now. Her powerful legs pushed off the ground, leaping over dry grass and scattered stones as she sprinted toward the road. Each step was driven by desperation. The smell of gasoline and food scraps filled her nose as she approached the outskirts of the city. The concrete jungle loomed ahead, tall buildings, moving cars, and unfamiliar sounds. Her instinct screamed for her to turn back, but she couldn't. She slipped into a narrow alleyway, where the air was thick with the scent of discarded food and damp pavement. A man stood near a dumpster, tossing out garbage. His clothes were dusty, his hands calloused. He smelled of earth and sweat, someone who worked hard. She watched him for a moment, her heart beat wild in her chest. Then, before she could second-guess herself, she lunged forward. The man barely had time to react before the bobcat pressed her body against his legs, letting out a desperate, pleading cry. His first instinct was to step back, fear flashing in his eyes. Wild animals didn't behave this way. She pawed at his boots, looking up at him with wide, pleading eyes. Her breathing was ragged, her body trembling. The man hesitated, his mind battling between fear and curiosity. Was she sick? Injured? Then, as if understanding her silent plea, he crouched down, extending a cautious hand. She didn't flinch. Instead, she rubbed her head against his arm, her eyes flicking toward the road, toward the place she had come from. Something inside him shifted. This wasn't an attack. This was a mother begging for help. His hands tensed, realization dawning. Somewhere out there, her cubs were in trouble. His gaze followed hers toward the wilderness. And then, without another thought, he stood up. "All right, girl," he murmured. "Take me to them." The bobcat wasted no time. She turned sharply and bolted back toward the open road. The man followed, his heart pounding. He didn't know what he would find, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't ignore a mother's cry for help. The mother bobcat stood anxiously near the man's feet, her golden eyes filled with desperation. She let out a soft, pleading cry, nudging his leg with her head. The man, still in shock at the sight of the fragile cubs in his arms, swallowed hard. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his grip, trying to keep the weak little creatures warm. The street was quiet, with only the distant hum of the city in the background. The bobcat had chosen her path carefully. She had come here for a reason. Somewhere deep in her wild instincts, she understood that humans could be both dangerous and kind. And now, she was betting everything on this one man standing in front of her. She let out another soft but urgent cry. Her tail twitched, her muscles tense as if she was preparing to bolt if he made the wrong move. But she didn't run. Instead, she took a step back, turned toward the road, and then looked at him again. She was asking him to follow. The man hesitated for only a moment before he made his decision. "I can't leave them here," he muttered to himself, glancing down at the cubs. One of them stirred weakly, its tiny paw reaching out as if grasping for something that wasn't there. That was enough for him. He adjusted his hold on the cubs, making sure they were secure, then nodded toward the mother bobcat. "All right, girl, lead the way." Without wasting another second, the bobcat turned and started trotting forward. The man followed, careful to keep up with her pace while ensuring the cubs were safe. Every few steps, the mother bobcat would glance back to make sure he was still with her. The city lights faded as they moved further away, entering the outskirts where the land began to blend into the wilderness. The man knew this area well. He had lived near the forest's edge for years, working as a wildlife conservationist. That's why, despite the unusual situation, he wasn't afraid. But he was worried. The cubs in his arms weren't just weak. They were dying. Their small bodies were burning up, their breathing shallow. He needed to act fast. But where was she leading him? The bobcat suddenly picked up her pace, sprinting forward. The man tightened his grip on the cubs and followed, his breath coming faster as they crossed the final stretch of land before entering the forest. And then he saw it, a small, makeshift den hidden among the rocks. The entrance was barely big enough for the mother bobcat to squeeze through, but it was clear this had been her home. The man carefully stepped closer. Inside the den, he saw what she had been so desperate to show him, a fourth cub, and this one was barely alive. It lay curled up, its tiny body shivering violently. Its fur was thinner than the others, and its breathing was so faint it almost seemed non-existent. The mother bobcat let out a sorrowful cry, circling the den anxiously. The man crouched down, his heart pounding. He carefully placed the 3 cubs beside their sibling. The mother bobcat immediately moved to them, licking their fur, nudging them gently as if urging them to fight for their lives. The man clenched his fists. He couldn't just stand there and do nothing. He had medical supplies back at his cabin. If he acted fast, he could still save them. His mind raced through the possibilities. Taking wild animals home was dangerous, but if he left them here, they wouldn't make it through the night. He looked at the mother bobcat. She had put all her trust in him, and he wouldn't betray that trust. Taking a deep breath, he pulled off his jacket and gently wrapped all 4 cubs inside. The mother bobcat let out a distressed sound, stepping forward as if she was afraid he would take them away forever. But he spoke softly. "I'm going to help them," he assured her. "Come with me." The bobcat hesitated. Then, as if understanding his words, she followed as he turned back toward the city. This was just the beginning, but he had made a promise, and he was going to keep it. The man moved quickly, cradling the fragile cubs in his arms, while the mother bobcat trotted anxiously beside him. The wind had picked up, sending a chill through the night air. The city lights shimmered in the distance, but his focus remained on one thing: getting these cubs to safety before it was too late. His cabin wasn't far. It stood at the edge of the forest, just before the wilderness melted into the outskirts of the town. A secluded place, quiet and undisturbed, where he had spent years studying wildlife. Tonight, that knowledge would be tested like never before. The mother bobcat kept her pace steady, though her golden eyes flickered with fear. She had taken a risk by trusting this human, but something in her instincts told her she had made the right choice. The cubs stirred weakly in the man's arms. Their tiny bodies trembled, their breathing uneven. He could feel the heat radiating from their fur. They were burning up with fever. His heart pounded harder. "They'll be okay," he whispered, as much to himself as to the mother bobcat. "I won't let them die." Finally, the cabin came into view, a modest wooden structure nestled between the trees. It wasn't large, but it had everything he needed. As they reached the front door, he fumbled for his keys, his fingers stiff from the cold. The mother bobcat paced restlessly beside him, her tail flicking as she watched his every move. The door swung open, and warmth rushed out to greet them. The man stepped inside, careful not to jostle the cubs. The mother bobcat hesitated at the threshold. For a wild animal, stepping into a human's home was a terrifying thought. But her babies were in there. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. The man wasted no time. He placed the cubs on a soft blanket near the fireplace, where the warmth could reach them. Then he rushed to a cabinet, pulling out medical supplies, sterile cloth, a dropper, and a few vials of medicine he kept for emergencies. The mother bobcat watched him closely, her muscles tense. He knelt beside the cubs, carefully inspecting them. Dehydration, malnourishment, fever. They were in worse shape than he had thought. He needed to act fast. He grabbed a small dropper, filled it with lukewarm water, and gently pressed a few drops into the mouth of the weakest cub. At first, there was no response. His stomach tightened. "Come on, Little one, he murmured, trying again. A tiny movement. The cub swallowed, its body twitching slightly. Relief washed over him. That's it, he said softly. One by one, he repeated the process, carefully hydrating each cub. Then he prepared a mild nutrient solution, something gentle enough for their weak bodies but strong enough to keep them going. The mother bobcat moved closer, her breath warm against his hand. She watched as he worked, her eyes filled with something that looked almost like hope. She was beginning to trust him, but the fight wasn't over yet. The smallest cub, the one that had been left in the den, was still struggling. Its breathing was faint, its tiny body barely moving. A deep ache settled in the man's chest. If he had arrived just a little later— No, he refused to think that way. He had to keep trying. Carefully, he picked up the smallest cub, wrapping it in a warm towel. He held it close to his chest, letting his body heat seep into its fragile frame. The mother bobcat let out a low, worried sound. She's still fighting, the man said, meeting her gaze. She just needs a little more time. The mother bobcat nudged the cub gently, her rough tongue brushing over its fur. Minutes passed. Then, a tiny weak mew. The cub stirred, its paw twitching. A breath of relief escaped the man's lips. She's still here, he whispered. The mother bobcat let out a soft sound, pressing her nose against her baby. But they weren't safe yet. The cubs needed rest, hydration, warmth, and most of all, they needed their mother. The man stepped back, giving the bobcat space. She immediately curled around her cubs, pulling them close. Her body trembled slightly, exhausted from the fear and stress of the past few days. But she didn't let go. She wouldn't let go. The man sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. For now, they were safe. But tomorrow, he would have to make a decision, because saving them was only the first step, and the real challenge was yet to come. The cabin was silent, except for the faint crackling of the fireplace. Warmth filled the small space, pushing away the cold that clung to the night outside. The mother bobcat lay curled around her cubs, their tiny bodies pressed against her for comfort. They were still weak, but their breathing was steady now. That was a good sign. The man sat nearby, watching them with cautious eyes. His body ached from exhaustion, but he wasn't ready to rest yet. He had done everything he could for now, hydrated them, warmed them, given them a safe space, but their condition was still critical. He knew the night would be long. With a deep breath, he stood up and quietly walked toward his kitchen. He needed to prepare food, something soft and digestible for the cubs when they woke. His mind raced through everything he had learned about bobcat care. He had studied wildlife for years, but nothing had ever prepared him for this. A mother bobcat trusting him enough to bring her babies into his home. He glanced over his shoulder. She was watching him. Her golden eyes followed his every move. Still wary, still unsure he could truly be trusted. He understood. Trust didn't come easily in the wild. After heating some broth, he poured it into a small dish and placed it near the mother bobcat. She sniffed it cautiously but didn't move. "It's for you," he said softly. "You need strength too." She hesitated for a long moment. Then, slowly, she leaned forward and lapped at the liquid. The man exhaled, relieved. Progress. But as much as he wanted to celebrate the small victory, he knew their fight wasn't over. These cubs were still in danger. Not from the cold, not from starvation, but from the world outside. The man ran a hand through his hair, his mind turning over the possibilities. Bobcats were wild animals. They weren't meant to stay with humans. But these cubs were fragile, too weak to survive on their own. Releasing them back into the wild now would be a death sentence. Yet, keeping them here wasn't a solution either. The mother bobcat wouldn't stay forever. She was here because she had no other choice. Once her cubs were strong enough, she would return to the forest. Would they be ready? Could he prepare them in time? His jaw tightened. He had to. He owed it to them. The mother bobcat let out a soft growl, snapping him out his thoughts. He turned to see one of the cubs stirring. The smallest one. It stretched weakly, letting out a faint mew. The mother bobcat immediately nuzzled it, her tongue brushing over its tiny body. It was a sign of life. The man knelt beside them, watching closely. "Hey, little one," he murmured. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" The cub's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. For the first time, a flicker of hope settled in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. Just as he allowed himself that moment of relief, a sudden noise shattered the silence. A knock. The mother bobcat's head snapped up, her body instantly tensing. The man frowned. No one ever came here at this hour. He stood up, moving cautiously to the door. His hand hovered over the handle before finally pulling it open. A cold gust of air rushed in. A figure stood outside, bundled in a thick coat. It was his neighbor, an older man named Bill, who lived a few miles away. Bill's eyes flicked past him, landing on the mother bobcat inside. His brows shot up. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "You really do have a wildcat in there." The man stepped outside, closing the door behind him to keep the warmth inside. "What are you doing here, Bill?" he asked, keeping his voice even. Bill let out a breath, his face serious. "Sheriff came by earlier," he said. "Said some folks in town spotted a bobcat wandering near the streets. They're worried, think it might be dangerous." The man's stomach sank. "They want to track her?" he asked. Bill nodded, talking about calling animal control. A wave of frustration surged through him. People feared what they didn't understand. "She's not a threat," he said firmly. "She came looking for help." Bill sighed. "I know you, son. I know you wouldn't take in an animal like this unless it needed you. But the town doesn't see it that way." The man clenched his jaw. If animal control got involved, the cubs would be taken, separated from their mother, put in captivity. If they even survived the stress of it, he couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't. Bill studied him for a long moment, then shook his head with a small chuckle. "You've always been stubborn," he muttered. "What are you going to do?" The man took a deep breath. "I'll figure something out." Bill gave him a look but didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small package. "Brought you some extra blankets," he said. "Figured you might need 'em." The man took them, a lump forming in his throat. "Thanks, Bill." Bill nodded. "Just be careful," he said, "and keep that cat out of sight." Then, with a final glance at the cabin, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. The man stood there for a long moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had to act fast. He turned back to the cabin, his mind racing. The cubs were still recovering. The mother bobcat needed rest. But they didn't have much time. Tomorrow, everything could change, and he had to be ready. The wind howled outside the cabin, rattling the wooden walls as the man sat in deep thought. The flickering glow of the fireplace cast long shadows across the room. The mother bobcat curled protectively around her cubs, her sharp eyes flickering toward the door every now and then. She knew something was wrong, and so did he. Bill's warning echoed in his mind. The town's worried. They might call animal control. That meant one thing. He was running out of time. The cubs were better than before, but they weren't ready to survive on their own yet. If animal control found them, they'd be taken away, separated from their mother, possibly put in captivity. He clenched his fists. He couldn't let that happen. But what could he do? If he released them too soon, they wouldn't survive. If he kept them here any longer, they'd be taken away. He needed a plan. The mother bobcat let out a soft growl, pulling him from his thoughts. She was restless now, sensing the tension in the air. She nudged one of her cubs with her nose, urging it to move. The tiny creature let out a small mew, but didn't have the strength to stand. That was it. That was the answer. They weren't strong enough to go back to the wild yet, but what if he took them somewhere safe? Somewhere far from the town's reach? His heart pounded as the idea took shape in his mind. There was a remote part of the forest, deep beyond the hills, where humans rarely went. It was untouched, wild, and full of natural resources. If he could get them there, they would have a chance. The mother bobcat could raise them in peace. But it wouldn't be easy. The journey would be long, and the cubs were still weak. Could they make it? He glanced at the mother bobcat. Her eyes met his, steady and fierce. Yes, they had to try. He wasted no time. Moving quickly, he grabbed an old backpack from his shelf and filled it with supplies, extra blankets, a water bottle, and a few pieces of soft food for the cubs. Then he turned to the mother bobcat. "We're leaving," he told her, his voice firm but gentle. She didn't move. Did she understand? He crouched down, slowly reaching out his hand. She tensed but didn't growl. That was enough trust for now. Carefully, he picked up the weakest cub and wrapped it in a small cloth, tucking it into his jacket for warmth. The other two nestled close to their mother. He adjusted the backpack, tightened his boots, and took one last look around the cabin. There was no turning back now. The moment he stepped outside, the cold hit him like a wall. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The sky was still dark, the moon casting an eerie glow over the landscape. He pulled his jacket tighter and started walking. The mother bobcat moved silently beside him, her body low to the ground. She kept glancing at him, her golden eyes filled with determination. They had a long way to go. The forest was dense, the trees stretching high above them like silent guardians. Twigs cracked under his boots, but the bobcat made no sound. She was built for this world. He wasn't. After an hour of walking, his legs ached, but he didn't stop. The cub in his jacket shifted slightly, letting out a faint whimper. He placed a hand over it, reassuring it with gentle warmth. "We're almost there," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if it was true. Just as they reached a clearing, something changed. The mother bobcat froze. Her ears twitched. Then, a deep growl rumbled from the darkness. The man's breath caught in his throat. His eyes darted around, searching the shadows. Another predator, and it wasn't small. He tightened his grip on the cub. The mother bobcat took a defensive stance, her body tense and ready to fight. A low snarl came from the trees ahead. Then movement. A pair of glowing eyes appeared in the darkness. A coyote. No, not one. Two. Maybe more. His heart pounded. This was bad. The bobcat could handle one coyote on her own, but a pack? Not with weak cubs. And not with him slowing them down. The coyotes stepped closer, their teeth flashing in the moonlight. They had smelled the cubs. They saw an opportunity. The mother bobcat let out a fierce growl, her fur bristling. But the coyotes didn't back down. They were hungry. The man's mind raced. They needed to run. But where? His eyes darted to the left. Trees, thick and tangled. To the right, a rocky slope leading to higher ground. He made a decision. "Go!" he shouted, pointing toward the slope. The mother bobcat hesitated. Then she understood. In a flash, she grabbed one cub in her mouth and bolted toward the rocks. The coyotes lunged. The man didn't think. He moved. With the cub still tucked in his jacket, he swung his backpack off his shoulder and hurled it at the nearest coyote. It yelped, startled, but the others kept coming. His adrenaline surged. He grabbed a fallen branch and swung it wildly, forcing them back. "Come on, then," he shouted. His heart pounded. The coyotes circled, but they hesitated. Good. That was all he needed. He took a step back, then another, before turning and sprinting toward the slope. The mother bobcat was already climbing, her cub in her jaws. The second cub clung to the rocks, struggling to follow. He pushed himself harder, faster. The coyotes barked behind him, their claws scraping against the dirt. Almost there, he reached the slope, grabbing onto the rocks with one hand, while holding the cub close with the other. The mother bobcat had reached the top. She turned, watching him. She was waiting. He pushed himself up, his muscles burning. The coyotes snapped at his heels, but they weren't climbers. They hesitated at the bottom, growling in frustration. Then, silence. The man finally reached the top and collapsed onto cold ground, gasping for breath. They had made it. Barely. The mother bobcat nuzzled her cubs, checking them for injuries. They were safe. For now. But the journey wasn't over yet, and dawn was approaching. The first light of dawn peeked over the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. The air was still cold, but the danger of the night had passed. The man sat on the rocky ledge, catching his breath. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from exhaustion. Beside him, the mother bobcat curled around her cubs, licking their fur and checking for injuries. The smallest one, the one he had carried in his jacket, let out a weak but hopeful mew. They were safe for now, but they weren't done yet. He turned his gaze forward, looking at the dense forest below. Somewhere in that wilderness was their destination, the remote part of the woods where humans never went, a place where the Bobcat family could live freely, without fear of animal control or predators lurking in the shadows. It wasn't far now, but the hardest part of the journey was still ahead. The mother bobcat was restless. She paced along the rocky ledge, sniffing the air. The close call with the coyotes had made her uneasy. She was a wild animal, born to survive, and her instincts told her something wasn't right. She turned to the man, her golden eyes filled with uncertainty. For the first time, he saw hesitation in her. She had trusted him so far, but was she still willing to follow him? He took a deep breath and crouched down, speaking softly. "I know. You don't trust me completely, and you shouldn't." He gestured toward the forest ahead. "But if you go back now, you're putting them in danger. This is your best chance." The mother bobcat didn't move. Her ears flicked back. She glanced at her cubs, then back at the path ahead. For a long moment, she didn't make a sound. Then she took a step forward. She had made her choice. The journey continued. The rocky terrain gave way to thick undergrowth, making every step a challenge. Vines tangled around the man's boots, and the ground was uneven, forcing him to move carefully. The mother bobcat was ahead of him now, moving with silent grace, her cubs close behind. He kept a steady pace, watching the forest for any signs of danger. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became. No distant howls, no rustling in the bushes, just the sound of their footsteps on the damp earth. It was almost too quiet. A bad feeling settled in his chest. Something was wrong. The mother bobcat suddenly stopped. Her body tensed. Her ears perked. The man froze. His eyes scanned the surroundings, his breath caught in his throat. Then a low growl. From above, his heart stopped. A shadow moved through the trees, shifting between the branches with quiet precision. A mountain lion, the ultimate predator of these woods, and it had been watching them. The mother bobcat let out a warning snarl, placing herself between her cubs and the looming threat above. The mountain lion didn't move. It was waiting, calculating. It could strike at any moment. The man's grip tightened around the small knife in his pocket. It was useless against a predator like this, but it was all he had. He knew one thing for sure. If the mountain lion attacked, there was no way they'd survive. The mother bobcat knew it too. She didn't wait. With a sudden burst of energy, she grabbed the weakest cub and bolted into the trees. The man didn't hesitate. He scooped up the second cub and ran after her. Branches whipped against his face as he sprinted to the dense undergrowth. Behind him, he heard the heavy thud of the mountain lion landing on the ground. It was chasing them. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he didn't slow down. The mother bobcat was faster, leaping over obstacles with ease. The cub in his arms whimpered, clinging to his jacket. A fallen log appeared ahead, too high to jump. No time to go around. The man threw himself forward, rolling over the log and landing hard on the other side. Pain shot through his shoulder, but he ignored it. He scrambled to his feet and kept running. The trees began to thin. The ground sloped downward. Then he saw it, a small rocky passage ahead, a narrow gap between two boulders, just big enough for them to slip through. A dead end for the mountain lion. The mother bobcat darted inside with her cub. The man was right behind her. The second he made it through, he spun around just as the mountain lion lunged. It slammed into the rocks, just inches from him. A deep, angry snarl echoed through the passage. The beast had missed its prey, and now it couldn't follow. The man collapsed against a stone, gasping for air. His entire body was shaking, but they had made it. The mother bobcat gently placed her cub down, nudging it close to her chest. She turned to the man. For the first time, she didn't just look at him. She acknowledged him. A silent moment passed between them. Then, without a sound, she picked up her cub again and walked deeper into the hidden passage. The man pushed himself up and followed. The worst was over. They were almost there. But he knew this wasn't the end. The final challenge was still waiting, and it would be the hardest one yet. The narrow passage opened into a small clearing, hidden deep within the forest. The air was cool, untouched by the outside world. Tall trees surrounded the area, like silent guardians, their thick canopies casting speckled shadows on the ground. A small stream trickled nearby, its gentle sound blending with the soft rustling of leaves. The man took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with exhaustion. They had made it. The mother bobcat hesitated, her ears twitching as she scanned her new surroundings. She placed her cub down, and for the first time since their journey began, she wasn't tense. She knew this was home. The man lowered the second cub to the ground, carefully unwrapping it from his jacket. It was still weak, but its tiny body stretched as it felt the earth beneath its paws. The mother bobcat immediately rushed to it, licking its fur and nudging it closer to her side. A feeling of relief washed over him. He had done it. He had saved them. But now it was time to go. He knew he didn't belong here. This was the wild, and he was just a visitor. He took a step back, ready to leave, but something stopped him. The mother bobcat was staring at him, not with fear, not with distrust, but with something else. For a brief moment, there was an understanding between them, an unspoken gratitude. She didn't purr. She didn't rub against him like a house cat would, but she didn't run either. And that was enough. With one last look, she turned away, guiding her cubs toward the dense undergrowth. The man watched them disappear into the trees, their small forms blending into the wilderness. And then they were gone. A long exhale escaped his lips. He hadn't realized how much tension he had been holding in his body. Looking around, he took in his surroundings one last time. This place, so far from the chaos of the city, felt untouched, sacred. It was where they belonged. His job was done. He turned and began walking back through the passage, retracing his steps toward civilization. Every step felt heavier than the last, not because of exhaustion, but because a part of him didn't want to leave. For the first time in a long time, he had done something that mattered, not for money, not for recognition, just because it was the right thing to do. And that feeling, it was unlike anything else. Hours later, the man emerged from the forest, stepping onto the outskirts of the city. The sounds of traffic, distant sirens, and hurried footsteps quickly replaced the peaceful stillness of the wilderness. Life moved on, just as it always had. He was just another person in the crowd now. No one knew what he had just been through. No one knew the life he had just saved. And yet, he didn't need them to. He felt the warmth of the rising sun against his skin, the cool morning breeze brushing past him. Everything felt different now. The world hadn't changed, but he had. As he walked down the familiar streets, his mind replayed the night's events. The mother bobcat, desperate and afraid, begging him for help. The cubs, weak and vulnerable, hanging on to life. The dangers they had faced, the storm, the coyotes, the mountain lion, and through it all, the trust that had formed between them. It was something no one would believe if he told them, but he didn't need to tell anyone, because deep inside he would always know. Somewhere out there, in the heart of the wilderness, a mother bobcat and her cubs were alive because he had chosen to help, and that was enough. As he neared his small apartment, he glanced up at the city skyline, the tall buildings standing like silent giants against the morning sky. Life would go back to normal. He would wake up tomorrow, go to work, and continue his routine like nothing had happened. But no matter how much time passed, no matter how many days faded into the next, he would never forget the night when a wild animal trusted him enough to lead her to safety. And deep down he knew neither would she.